Hi, everyone, and welcome to our talk tonight. I'm Dr. Nick Hartman. I'm the Director of Learning and Civic Engagement here at the NCSML, and I'm super thrilled to have such a large and enthusiastic crowd, not only in person, but for anybody tonight that will be watching on what is our first ever Facebook live stream. This is the first time that we have ever streamed one of our talks on Facebook, so for the people who decided to couch it tonight, this is their option. So before I introduce Ivan Backer, I just wanted to thank a couple of supporters. First of all, I wanted to thank, we had the support from the Thaler Holocaust Education Fund here in town. They have helped make a lot of our programs, this program, and also some of our Global Voices local action programs possible. So if you're from Thaler Foundation tonight, thank you very much for that. I also wanted to thank two of our sponsors, Victor F. and Janice L. Naxera. We deeply appreciate your support. So before I welcome Ivan to the stage, I want to just share a bit with you about him. A native of Czechoslovakia, Ivan Backer left in 1939 at the age of 10 as part of Sir Nicholas Witten's kinder transport trains bound for England. In an unusual situation, he joined his father and brother in England, followed by his mother at a later time. From 1940 to 1942, Ivan attended a Moravian boarding school in Yorkshire and became a Christian during the war, eventually moving to the United States with his family in 1944. He went on to attend Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and eventually went to seminary at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where he graduated. After several years of working in other industries, Ivan decided to focus on ministry, becoming an Episcopal pastor in New Jersey, while being involved in civil rights and anti-war movements in the 1960s and 1970s. Eventually taking a position at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, his role was largely to connect campus and community, specifically neighborhoods, government, and city businesses. A father of 3 and a grandfather of 6, Ivan is accompanied today by his long-term partner, Paula Fisher. His memoir, My Train to Freedom, A Jewish Boy's Journey from Nazi Europe to a Life of Activism, was published in January and will be available after the talk. There'll be an opportunity for a book signing. So I'd like everyone to please welcome to the stage Mr. Ivan Backer.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming. Dobrý večer, krajani, vážené dámy a páni. I'll translate for you. I just wished everybody a good evening, and ladies and gentlemen. So I want to give you in my introduction kind of an overview of this book that I wrote, My Train to Freedom, a Jewish boy's journey from Nazi Europe to a life of activism. And then I'll put some more meat on that introduction, which gave you the skeleton version of my life. There are really 3 themes to the book that I wrote, which is a memoir of my personal life and what happened to me as a boy. The first part of the book is a description of my very young life in Czechoslovakia. I had a very happy boyhood. I have lovely memories of visiting the countryside. My grandparents lived in a little town called Dobruška. And that was brutally interrupted in 1938 when the Munich Pact was signed, giving away the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. And that was the land that really bordered the Czechoslovakia and was the center of the defenses of our country. And with that gone, it was easy for Hitler to march in March 1939 and take the rest of the country in what he called a protectorate. And then I want to talk about my years in England during the war. And that was quite an adventure. And the third part of the book is my arrival in the States and what happened afterwards, especially as a result of what I had just witnessed in the past 6 years on the world stage. So 1939 was really a crucial year for me. I witnessed in March the marching in of the German troops. It was an ordinary day. We had not listened to the news. We didn't realize that the German troops had crossed the border. And on my way to school with my good friend Jirka, which means George in English, we saw people crying on the street. And we knew exactly what had happened, that we had lost our freedom. And indeed, that was the case. I then boarded the fourth Kindertransport that Nicholas Winton organized. You probably all have heard of Nicholas Winton because he was on the CBS News and 60 Minutes with interviews of him. He was a remarkable man. He was a 29-year-old stockbroker in 1939, and instead of going on a skiing vacation as he had planned over the Christmas break in 1938, his friend was already in Prague and said to him, "You have to come here and witness what's going on." And he saw the refugees from the Sudetenland, and he also realized that no one was taking care of the children. This is against the background of Kindertransports that have been organized by a lot of different groups, mainly Quakers, to get children out of Germany and also out of Austria. And when he realized that there was nobody taking care of the Czech children, he really took it upon himself to organize these trains. Kindertransport means children's trains in German. And so he set about, mainly by his own efforts, to get us children out, and he saved 669 children all told. He had to organize the families in England that received us, that vouched for us to get the British entry permit. They had to put up £50, which in those days was a very significant amount of money. And then he had to also pay the Germans. You had to organize the trains. They always wanted more money. And he did it all. And then nobody really, he didn't hide it, but his life went on. He went into the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And after the war, there were other interests. But his wife found a scrapbook in 1988, 50 years later, and asked, "What are these children?" With some with red circles around them. And so he explained what he had done, and she knew a editor or producer of a television program called My Life. And so they featured him and said, now they invited the audience to be kindertransport children. They didn't know my address, so I didn't even know about the event. But as she told the story of what he had done in saving that many children, she asked everybody who was a kindertransport survivor or escapee to stand, and the whole audience stood. It's one of the most chilling moments. It's contained in a video called Nikki's Family that has been shown around, and it's available from Amazon as well. He died 2 years ago in 2015 at the age of 106. But in the meantime, after that television program, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. He was in Prague, received various honors and recognition. So it's been an amazing story. So in my memoir, I describe some of these events beginning in 1938 with the Punic Agreement, as I mentioned. And in response, my mother realized very strongly that she had to get her immediate family out. It also illustrates some of the difference between Jewish mothers and fathers in response to the Hitler threat. It was mainly the women who recognized the danger and were so determined to get their kids out. Many of the fathers believed it would blow over eventually and things would be okay again. So my mother organized a business trip for my father, which was really a planned escape. And he took the last free train from Czechoslovakia on March 14, 1939, to England. On the 15th in the morning, the German troops moved in. Then my brother, who is 8 years older than I, was going to college and in England and had already been accepted, except he needed a Gestapo permit. And for that, he had to have confirmation that he had been accepted at Margate College in England. But the man wouldn't give it to her. And so this is what she did. This is in her own words, from which are quoted in the book. I need to put it here so that I can still speak into the mic. I went to my English teacher, Miss Hands. She was an admirable woman, but old and not well. I said to her, "You have to have the generosity to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and accompany me to see this man. I cannot budge him, and I cannot reach him. But at 6 a.m., the maid cannot say that he is not in. You are British, and you can talk to him in a way which I could never do." Miss Hands agreed, and she did it. I can still see her before me. She took a taxi and met me at the door of the man's apartment. It was 6 a.m. So we got him out of bed, quite literally. Miss Hands spoke beautifully. She said, quote, "You cannot do this. You have accepted several thousand francs. The boy has to get out. It was promised after all." I cannot recall this is my mother again. I cannot recall the words, of course, but it was an inspiring confrontation. And he did it. He wrote out the confirmation there at that moment, and that franc was accepted and he had to be in England for the beginning of the term. So he made it. He made it before the end of March because that was the deadline to get to England without a special visa. So two of the four of us in the immediate family were out, my father and my brother. I was next. In May of 1939, I boarded the fourth kinder transport organized by Nicholas Winton. This is the scene at the railroad station as I describe it in the book. The station was swarming with German soldiers looking very stern and frightening to me. But what is etched most in my memory is the 60 of us children standing about with number tags, my number was 1174, hanging from our necks, surrounded by parents, grandparents, and other relatives who had come to see us off of this scheduled kinder transport from Prague to England. Adults were crying and hugging and kissing us, fearing they would never see their children again. Some children, particularly the older ones, were trying to wiggle out of the embraces that held them too tightly. Both young and old found it difficult to say goodbye. My mother and aunt were there to see me off, but our farewells lacked the visible emotion of so many around us. My mother was stoic. She had accepted weeks ago that sending me to England was assuring my survival. I myself was looking forward with excitement to the trip, as I had been told my father would be waiting for me at my final destination, which was a great comfort since most children have to leave both parents behind. And I might say, adding that most of the parents didn't survive and perished, and so those children remained staying with their English supporting family. My mother was the last one to leave, and hers is really the most harrowing experience because she got caught on the border, but it was the eve of the invasion of Poland and the beginning of the war, September 1, 1939. And so when she was caught on the border, there were only three people, officials, at that particularly small railroad station, the commandant, one soldier, and one nurse. So they strip searched her, took all the money that she had, and spilled out the contents of the three heavy suitcases she had with her, and said, the commandant said, "I can't be bothered with a dirty Jewess now," and let her go. And she walked across the Belgian border, one at a time with each of those three suitcases, but she was safe. And in Belgium, in Brussels, she had some contacts from whom she borrowed money. So I arrived in England in mid-May of 1939. The next Monday morning, I was sent to the local school, knowing very few words of English. But it's amazing how young children, I was 10 years old, not quite, could learn a new language very fast, and I did. And that summer, we went to what's called in England the seaside, the shore, on vacation, and I was playing with some children, And by September, when school began again, I was not bad in English anymore. And what happened next was very, very interesting. War had broken out, and the British government decided to evacuate all the children from London to the Midlands, in the country where they suspected would not be any German air raids. The government anticipated that German bombing of London would begin almost immediately. Luckily, they were wrong about that. So I was sent to a town in the Midlands called Northampton, an industrial, pretty rugged country. And we arrived at the station and were divided into groups of 10 or 12. And under the guidance with one English lady or volunteer, she would take us to a street and knocked on every door. These were working people. They were row houses, 2 stories high, certainly not wealthy people. And she would ask the lady who came to the door, "These are children from London. How many can you take?" And the 10 or 12 of us found a home. I was the last two, there were 2 of us, and we were the last ones. And when she knocked on the door of this house, there were only 2 more houses to go. And it was a dead-end street, and I was really worried, where am I going to sleep tonight? But she said, well, she sort of hemmed and hawed, and she said, well, I have one son, and he has a double bed all to himself. I'll take both of them. And I illustrate this story because I think it shows the wonderful spirit of the British people at that moment in history. You know, they just opened their doors and their hearts to us. And it was really, especially in retrospect, it's so wonderful to have witnessed such generosity. I attended 3 schools in rapid succession in 1939, the local London school, then the school in Northampton, and finally I arrived in Wiltshire. My mother, who by that time was in England, had got a new position as a governess to a wealthy family in the country in Wiltshire, sort of north of Stonehenge, for those of you who may have visited that. And I arrived on the day when they were sponsoring a fox hunt. And so there were these dogs and horses ready to go on the hunt, which they did later. But for me, it was an experience because it was a big house, or in my eyes, it was a big house. When I later visited it as an adult, it was a pretty big but modest, as country homes go. And I was sent to the local school and was there only for about 3 months before the Czech government in exile in London organized a boarding school for Czech children. And I went there for the first year. And then my mother thought, as long as you're in England, you have to get a proper English education, which meant a so-called public school, which was really a private school. It's very confusing. But I was sent to this boys' school called Punic Boys' School, and it was in Yorkshire. Those of you who might know that part of the country, it was near Leeds. And I found there, it was run by the Moravian Church, which is a small Protestant denomination, which had its origin 500 years earlier in Moravia, a province of Czechoslovakia. So there was that tie-in as well. But Punic was for me a very comforting experience because it was a community. It was a community who accepted me as a Jewish child and gave me support and acceptance. And I had such a good experience there that I wanted to become a part of this community. And that's why I was baptized there, became a Christian, and also wanted to be a medical missionary. That was influenced a lot by having read a good deal about Albert Schweitzer, who had established a hospital in what later became the Congo. And his work there for the natives. Well, that wasn't quite how it turned out. Although I had been accepted at medical school, I determined not to go. And my activism, which is part of the title of my book, really concentrated on social justice and peace. And that's where I spent much of my later years working. So I'm often asked, why did you write this memoir? And there are several reasons. One is that it's a historical record. And as most of us who escape or survive are getting older, I think it's even more important to preserve a first-hand account of what happened. And I think it's tremendously important to recall those days for the future as a record and as a first-hand account. Secondly, I wanted to pay tribute to my parents. As an adult, I realized how difficult it must have been for parents to give up their children, knowing that they may not see them again, and yet send them off to safety. And indeed, many of the children and many of their parents did not survive. Thirdly, I wanted to pay tribute to Nicholas Winton. I had not known who my savior was from the Holocaust until maybe 10, 15 years ago now, when it became so public. We had no idea who he was and who was responsible for organizing those transports. And lastly, the reason that I wrote it was that I had written some vignettes about my experiences and had shared them with an audience that had in attendance a book agent. And book agents are not easy to get, and she volunteered to become my literary agent and really sold the book to publishers, and that Skyhorse Publishing did publish it. So you might be interested briefly what activism I engaged in. ADA stands for Americans for Democratic Action, and in the 1960s was on the cutting edge of civil rights and peace. And I became a member and a state chairman of that organization. I became president of the Bergen Council, which is a council in New Jersey, a council of churches. I participated in civil rights. I was on the March to Washington in 1963. I visited congressional offices and in both locally and in Washington. And then last year, I had the wonderful opportunity, after the book was published in January of last year, to visit many places and meet many people in conjunction with the publishing of my book. One of those people was a family in Connecticut that was hosting Barbara Winton, the daughter of St. Nicholas Winton, and who had just written a biography of her father. And so we had a great visit. We exchanged signed books, and it was interesting to get an insight into her father and the personal relationship that they had. You know, people who are lionized publicly are not often easy parents to get along with. And that was the case there. We also later got to meet Sir Nicholas's son, who's also named Nicholas, or Nicky, as his nickname, which was also a thrilling experience. And we met many other people at these occasions. So why was I spared the Holocaust? That is the question that has haunted me all my life. Why was I spared when so many others perished? So many of my family had not lived through it. And was there a reason? And I want to read you a passage very briefly on what I decided and how I decided. As I continued to mull over my future, I found I kept coming back to my escape from the Holocaust horrors that had befallen family, friends, and millions of people I didn't even know, but not me. I lived while so many of my own relatives whom I loved, parents and their children of my age, perished. Why? What would be my response to the central event of my young life, being spared a terrifying death? I contemplated how to integrate the meaning behind being saved into a purposeful life. The lingering question demanded an answer. At this time, my study of social ethics at Union Seminary started to become a dominant influence in my thinking. Joining the quest and struggle for social justice gradually evolved as my response to that question that haunted me, and I became committed to activism in different professional guises. At every step of my life, and especially decisions crucial about career and family, hung on answering that question. I also included in this memoir two accounts that have never been published of death marches from concentration camps in 1945, when the Allies were closing in on the Third Reich. One was my favorite aunt, Lizard, who had relatives that had escaped to all parts of the world. And every time one of those visitors from other lands came to New York where she lived, it was an obligatory visit to Aunt Lizard. She was the matriarch of the whole family. But she had never shared what had happened to her when she left Auschwitz. Finally, my cousin Paul and I implored her to tell us in her own words. And she laid out the ground rules. There were no tape recorders, no recordings, no photographs. I'll just tell you. And so she told us what she had experienced, and we later put it in written form. But this is what how I perceived that. But when Lizelot concluded her story, often with tears in her eyes, Paul and I were tremendously moved by what we had just heard. The recounting had obviously been very emotional for Lizelot, and we sympathized with her pain. We understood why she had not shared her account with us before. In past conversations with us, Lizelot had always spoken English, but during this interview, she switched to Czech, obviously feeling more comfortable relating this story in our language. After she ended the interview, Paul and I thought she seemed relieved to have told her story at last, after saying no to so many times. The family celebrated Lizelot's centennial birthdays a year before she died in 2004 at age 101. The second memoir, second story of the Death March, was much longer, but it's on my uncle Boleslav, who lived in Bratislava, who was not Jewish, but who was a bank manager and used the bank as the headquarters for a partisan cell. And later it was discovered by the Gestapo. He was arrested, sent to a concentration camp, and his account of how they moved from Flossenburg concentration camps, retreating constantly before the American army that was moving east against them, is a very moving account and detailed as well. Finally, I want to share with you my observations as in a section I called Afterward. For me, writing this memoir has been an exercise in honest probing and introspection. The Kindertransport not only saved me from the Holocaust, but also determined who I became. So I have tried to live responsibly on this planet. I began to address my natural disinclination to tell my story, let alone broadcast it, and realized I still have some boyhood shame in England for occasionally using my situation to elicit sympathy. For years, I chose not to disclose much about my background, my affiliation as both a Jew and a Christian. So this memoir resembles a coming out of the closet in that regard. Although my interpretation of deception or concealment on my part is not accurate, as Nicholas Winton said, I really didn't keep it a secret, I just didn't talk about it. The notion that people might genuinely be interested in learning about my past was brought home to me when I started to receive a few speaking invitations where I met new people. on a trip to Costa Rica with Paula, she mentioned something on my background in a dinner conversation, and those seated nearby were riveted by my brief summary and asked to hear more. Telling parts of my story in public has sharpened the focus of this memoir, and retirement has finally afforded me the time to write it. Our uncertain future confronts burdens from the past. As the world lurches from one crisis to the next, I sometimes feel helpless and even at times hopeless. The example of Nicholas Winton's unrelenting determination to find solutions that help others motivates me to continue to be an activist. And finally, I want to read you a poem which is printed in the book, which sort of summarizes and overviews everything. It's called Trains. Memories, distant yet fresh, of trains from Prague to visit grandparents and sled down long hills. Train from Czechoslovakia, longest and scariest with other kinder transport young ones through heart of Third Reich. Arrived Liverpool station, happy seeing my father, but foster family, Orthodox Jews, strange to me. War erupts, another train. London school children evacuate to Midlands for safety. A new family home. Attend 2 boarding schools, one Czech, the other English. Longer train rides ensue, bring sense of independence. Wartime voyage across Atlantic, convoy zigzags 2 perilous weeks, thrills me, exciting adventure. Land in Canada, overnight train to Montreal, entering United States, arrive Grand Central Station, discover world's largest city. Till now, each train met by someone, known or unfamiliar. Next train to college, no one waits. Now completely on my own. Station in Pennsylvania recalls earlier station 5 years before, nervous and scared until seeing father and new family. Years later, the Shoah film, Holocaust victims sardined in cattle cars, destined for gas chambers, recalled my escape. Trains brought death to some, for me, life. Saved from extinction. The question haunts me still, why was I spared? No explanation, blind chance or hidden design, no answer satisfies. I am forever grateful. I strive for life of purpose, struggle for social justice answers my search for meaning, becomes my North Star. Thank you very much. I hope we have some questions, because those are usually the most interesting part of the evening. So, who wants to ask a question?
Yeah, I saw a film the other day.
Wait for the mic, because everybody needs to hear it, including me.
I saw a film the other day called Into the Arms of a Stranger, also about the Kindertransport, and it profiled many people who had also been children. So I was wondering whether you belong to an organization or are in touch with any of the former Kindertransport children.
I am not, because I think there is an organization in England because many of the children stayed in England after the war, that brings people together. I'm not a part of them. I'm familiar with that video, and it's very moving because it has the experiences of 6 or 7 people who lived through the Kindertransport and then tell interesting stories of what happened to them. Yes. Oh, okay. Whatever order you, we'll get to you.
Do you ever see your friend George again? Right here. Did you ever see your friend George again?
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Did you ever see your friend George again?
Yes, I did. That's a really interesting story because after I left, we lost touch with each other, obviously. But in 1948, he went to a high school and wrote an article making fun of the communists. Well, that cost him 10 years in jail. And he wasn't married till later in life, didn't have any children. But unbeknownst to me, he left in 1968 to go to Toronto. And Toronto had a Czech newspaper that I subscribed to. And I saw that there had been erected a statue to freedom and by Czech volunteers, and then it listed his name, George Blaha. So I got in touch with the editor of the paper, got his address, contacted him back in Prague, back in the Czech Republic, and in 2000, my wife and I visited him, and it was really fun to be with him again. He was training dogs, hunting dogs, and I just marveled at how they obeyed.
Could you tell us a little bit about your experiences on the March to Washington in late August of 1963?
Yeah, that was a memorable experience because that was, of course, the setting for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. What was so wonderful about that was to look around at the Lincoln Memorial and see about 100,000 people, as they estimate, were present of all different kinds, different colors, the different ethnicities, and from all over the country. I mean, people traveled on buses for hours to get there. And then it was logistically organized so well that we marched, and there was a delegation sent to who was president?
LBJ.
Was it? No, it was LBJ at the time. Yeah.
Kennedy was still alive.
Okay, you're right. And to sort of hear reports of the negotiation, which didn't go anywhere. But it was the number of people who stood up for civil rights was really impressive.
How long was the train ride?
Good question. We left at 5 o'clock in the evening of one day, and we arrived on the third day in London about midday. So we spent one night on the train going through Germany, then we crossed the border into Holland. We continued on the train to Flushing in Holland, and then got on a ferry boat to cross the English Channel. And that was an experience because I'd never even been near the shore, so I didn't know what the sea was like. But that was evening, so I really didn't see the ocean, well, in the English Channel, till that morning when we woke up.
I'm struck by the young people who are here tonight, and some of them will hear a denial of the Holocaust. I would ask you to address that, and also, what are you doing for the next generations to preserve the thoughts of the Holocaust?
Well, to the first part, I don't see how one can be a denier. There are so many of us who lived through those days, some through concentration camps, who have given testimony, spoken in publicly, written about it, and then to say it didn't happen. It's just nonsense. And I don't know what there is. If they can't be convinced by the evidence that's there for everybody to see, I don't know what else we can do. The young people's reaction is very interesting. I've done some speaking in schools, not so many because the curriculums are so tight these days that there's no time really for outside speakers. But I've gone to the Holocaust Museum in Washington twice, and there's lots of school tours. And these young people have usually studied the Holocaust in some detail, so they know some of it, and they've come to see the Holocaust Museum to see the wonderful exhibits there. And when I'm there, they set me up in the gift shop, say Holocaust survivor, which I'm not. I call myself a Holocaust escapee, which I am. And a lot of the school groups before that time to go to the museum sort of milling around, and they wander into the gift shop, and when they see me, they come to me, usually buy the book, and then come ask questions. And I'm struck by the relevance of the questions. Like one person, one 8th grader, asked me, can the Holocaust happen again here? That's a complicated question. And I answer them by saying, well, I'm afraid it can. I'm afraid that the direction of the country towards authoritarianism and to legitimizing the anti-racism is very dangerous. And we have to be, as people, so vigilant now to make sure that doesn't happen. Or another question was, are you an optimist or a pessimist? That's not easy to answer. Because ultimately I am an optimist. But boy, at times it's hard.
So with your experience as time goes on, do you feel that teachings today about the Holocaust are being minimalized, or do you feel that they still have the same emphasis put on them as they have in the past?
That's a hard question. I really don't know that many teachers. I know some, and they teach the Holocaust, and I admire them for that. 2 blocks from me, there's a middle school called the Classical Magnet, and they had a whole unit on the Holocaust, and they showed the film Nicky's Family, and then had me speak afterwards. And you know, their reaction was so positive as to what happened in terms of the lives that Nicky went and saved. But I'm not sure that there are many replications of that kind of program. Did you have a question?
You mentioned almost casually the generosity of so many of the people in the United Kingdom, taking in people, children that they had, just because it was the right thing to do. And over the last few years, it's been particularly poignant to me as we look at what seems to be very much not that kind of sentiment in terms of the refugee, of the stranger. I mean, even the implications, the impact of the refugees that Germany took in having a negative impact in the election last week. And I wondered if you would speak, why do you think it seems that it was so different, that there was this openness, this generosity, that it doesn't feel like it's that same kind of warmth and connection and responsibility today?
That's a profound question, to which I don't really have an answer. But I think a lot of it has to deal with the homogeneity of the British people, and who recognized their own existential existence or continuance depends on that horrible German occupation that they might be subject to. I don't know, today's situation is so different, and yet, I would point to the generosity of American families taking in Syrian refugees and others. The whole emphasis on cities that are called safe havens now for others, and the American families that have taken in people, congregations that have sponsored families. So it's not altogether dead, but as we've seen with Angela Merkel's waning support, she's paid a price for, but she had the courage to admit 1 million foreigners. And the other thing I think is that in England we integrated, me as a what's called a Czech boy. So but somehow it wasn't as traumatic for British people to accept us. We were Europeans after all, so we shared a lot of the same values. But today it's different. So.
I'm curious, Rick, after leaving your home country and your hometown and your birthplace, were you able to go back to your birthplace and see it after the war?
Yep. I didn't go back till 1983, so, I was an adult. It was 40 years later. The same undistinguished apartment house was there on a very busy street. The street was busier then than it was when I was a boy. But the communists were in power, and I was an American by then. I had an American wife, So I was really an outsider by then. I tell you kind of a silly story. We went, my cousin and I, who were both Czechs, were talking Czech and went to a travel agency, a Czech travel agency. And so the woman went on the phone to find out something. And she says in Czech, I have these two Americans here. And I said, how did you know? Of course, we had cameras. But she said, well, you sort of speak Czech with an American accent. But, you know, I enjoyed being in Prague again, drinking Czech beer, eating Czech food. So it was and I've been back about 6 times. So I've seen some of the changes too.
How many Czechs had she met that spoke with an American accent?
One other. There's some questions here.
Yes, I have maybe 2 questions. Are you acquainted with Dr. Michael Evans?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, well, for your sake too, also, I'd like to introduce him if I could.
Okay.
He is one of the leading advocates to the Jews for Christianity. He established the Jewish International Prayer Group. My wife and I both send monthly gifts to them, what we can afford. Anyway, that money goes to feeding many of the people, the Holocaust survivors that are coming into the country, and they're overwhelmed and need support. And also, he's established a museum there. The Jewish people can come through and see how much the Christians love the Jewish people.
Where is the museum?
Pardon?
Where is the museum?
It's over in Israel.
I see.
Okay, and I don't know where he spends most of his time. Probably half of it here and half of it over there. He personally knows Mr. Netanyahu and 2 of the people that were leaders of Perez, I forget the other one. He personally not related, but he personally knows those people. He's had contact with them. And he's been a tremendous influence for Christianity to the Jewish people. And they need a lot of help, especially all the people coming into Israel, returning back to their homeland. And it just occurred to me, I didn't plan to say this, but maybe some of you here would like to help with that group. If so, I'll be here. I can forward your name and address to him, and he could send you information, and that would be a big help to the Jewish people. So.
Great.
I think we have time for one more question.
She who wears her hand most gets the mic.
I'm just very interested in what became of your parents, your father, your mother, your brother, they get together again.
Well, our family was first reunited in 1947 when my brother also came over here. We lived in New York City. Frank and I both were in college together, shared a bedroom. My father died in 1965, my mother in 84, and my brother last year. So he was 95 years old, and his is a more gripping story than mine.
I think that's all we have time for. We'll be doing the book summary.
Thank you all. It's been a wonderful audience, and I've enjoyed being with you. Oh, okay.
So just a quick announcement: we are going to have a book signing with Ivan here in the Grand Hall in just a few minutes. But I just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for coming tonight. I wanted to just let you know about a couple of events that we have coming up. If you have not seen Chihuly, it closes Sunday. So this is the last chance for this collection will be publicly shown. So if you haven't got a chance to come and see our Venetians exhibit, please do. On the 14th at 1 p.m., we have our Immigrant Foodways workshop, Crowded Out Loud, which is a sauerkraut making workshop. That's $5, and you can RSVP. And then Red Cedar Chamber Music will be playing Czech strings on the 15th at 3 p.m. I also wanted to just mention real quick, we have a new challenge right now. It's called the Korvash Challenge. Some of you may have heard this. We have a supporter from our museum who supports programs just like this one, Tony Korvash. And he's offered to match any donation of any size from $1 to $10,000 up to October 31st. He wanted to do this because he's very proud of his Czech heritage, and it helps make programs like Ivan's talk possible. So if you're interested in making a contribution to our challenge, you can go online to our website, ncsml.org, or you can go to our information desk for a donation form. Thank you all for coming.